This passage from Luke's gospel account is both comforting and frustrating, straightforward and disorienting, clear-cut, and some of the most challenging words Jesus ever spoke. This passage finds Jesus early on in his outward-facing ministry. He was preaching and teaching and healing in ways that stirred up the status quo. A welcomed relief for many who were experiencing oppression and exclusion, but a threat for those who exercised power, and too much of a risk for those who had figured out a way to navigate Roman occupation in a way that kept them comfortable and safe. As often happened when Jesus was around, a crowd had formed, and Jesus preaches this sermon within earshot of all those gathered for the benefit of everyone who will hear. But at the same time, these words are particularly directed to his disciples. Did you catch that this passage begins with, "Then Jesus looked up at his disciples and said." It's not been long since Jesus has called his 12 apostles, those who would leave everything to follow him, to learn from him, and who would, after his death, resurrection, and ascension, continue his work of fostering a community of those learning to follow in his way. And it's to these 12 and to anyone who would accept the invitation to follow that Jesus is preaching to. Because he knows that the road of following in his way, while filled with hope and promise, will be challenging all the same. And so he lays out some hard truths of what following him entails. Truths that upend what is typically deemed as blessed or valued. Because let's face it, when we think of blessing, of being blessed, our minds don't go to poverty, hunger, and exclusion. Blessed equals having enough, or even better, more than enough. Blessed equals being part of the inner circle, having influence, power, prestige. Blessed equals carefree living. Yet Jesus names these things as woes for those he tasks with carrying on his ministry, and instead shines a light on anyone who's had to decide between paying rent or buying groceries, anyone whose only source of shelter is a tent which is repeatedly torn down and taken away, anyone who is filled with sorrow because they witnessed another overdose or can't afford their medication, anyone who is othered or hated or disappeared because of their race or gender. God's blessing lives here, along with the promise that the kingdom of God belongs here too, which is both comforting and frustrating, because when you're hungry and filled with sorrow and have nowhere that feels safe, it's hard to feel blessed, and it's hard to imagine that Jesus is there among you, especially when there are those who attempt to hold Jesus hostage, ignoring the woes and ignoring those whom Jesus names as blessed, in order to fashion for themselves a false sense of security. From the beginning, it would seem that Jesus knows that this is going to be the temptation. Jesus knows that this is going to happen. Perhaps that's why he provides this map of blessings and woes. A map aimed to orient us to how the world, both then, today, and the world to come, is actually meant to work, despite appearances. Jesus is laying out ground rules that are shaped by God's grace. Ground rules that don't allow those who would follow him to pick and choose who's better or worse, who's worthy or unworthy, who's seen or unseen. And well, in my mind anyways, these blessings and woes shut down any idea of a prosperity gospel. We're left wondering, what does this mean for those who find themselves well off, well fed, and well respected? For those who are afforded privilege because of class or race or gender? What does this mean for many who sit in church pews or stand behind a pulpit on Sunday mornings? Jesus is quite clear that riches and prestige present major obstacles to gospel living. They act as distractions. They evoke arrogance and result in missed opportunities for truly generous living. These woes are a call to those with wealth and prestige, whether as a result of hard work or afforded by society's standards, to wake up, to take notice, and change as part of living into the rhythm of God's way of life, the way of grace, where those with money will give to those who are poor, where those with prestige will advocate for those without. And not only by writing a check or signing a petition, but through recognizing the importance and value of those whom Jesus named as blessed, and loving them as he did, as God does, which is near impossible to do when you wall yourself off physically, socially, spiritually from people and situations that cause one to pause and reconsider the things you thought were keeping you safe. And to be sure, this perceived safety, this false sense of security, it comes at an even greater cost. Because it ultimately breeds fear, it breeds suspicion, it leans into a way of scarcity that is at odds with God's way of abundance, in turn stifling the capacity to live into the fullness of our humanity, a humanity that is rooted in extraordinary hopefulness and extravagant love, gifts from God to be shared among all. Blessings and woes. But Jesus doesn't stop here. He continues and provides a straightforward yet disorienting glimpse of what living into extraordinary hopefulness and extravagant love looks like. And he sums this all up by calling us to do to others as you would have them do to you. Sounds clear-cut, and it's the most challenging thing in the world to do. Try as we might, time and again, we find ourselves keeping score, coming up with long lists of conditions, dodging the blow, striking back, and storing up our possessions. essentially getting stuck in the loop of woes. But God doesn't give up on us. We have been created in God's image. And the good news is that within each and every one of us is the capacity to learn to lean into this unconventional mode of living, a way that invites us to love, bless, pray, and give. Today, as we celebrate All Saints' Day, this is what we recall and remember in the lives of those we name as saints, which includes the disciples whom Jesus was speaking to all those years ago. It was their willingness to serve in a way that recognized that the grace of God was already at work all around them, and that they were being called to enter into this work, continually striving to love, pray, bless, and give, all while living imperfect lives. And this inspires and gives us courage to strive to do the same. Because we too are Jesus' disciples. And Jesus looks at us as he speaks these words we hear from him this morning. My prayer for us is that again and again we return to Jesus' map of blessing and woes, to this unconventional and inconvenient way of being in the world, and locate ourselves among those striving to love, pray, bless, and give, which ought to find us elbow to elbow with those whom Jesus calls blessed. Like the followers of Jesus who showed up at the Broadview Ice Processing Center near Chicago to break bread with those being detained, only to be denied. Or like the members of clergy and congregation from St. Stephen's in the Fields here in Toronto who welcome those with nowhere else to go, offering a safer place to stay on church property until the encampment was forcibly cleared, less than 24 hours after being lifted up as a safe haven by the city. Or like Jubilee Episcopal Church in Austin, Texas, who is doubling down on being a place of belonging for 2S LGBTQIA+ people, despite the state recently ordering the removal of rainbow crosswalks, citing them as a safety hazard, and after facing several events of harassment on Sunday mornings. Love, pray, bless, and give. An unconventional and inconvenient way of being in the world that brings us elbow to elbow with the blessed, elbow to elbow with saints in the making.